She stood in that cramped supply closet they called a classroom, sorting through outdated textbooks and broken pencils, her cardigan worn thin at the elbows. Sarah Mitchell looked like every substitute teacher you'd ever forgotten, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of person who apologized for taking up space. The students at Lincoln High had already decided she was weak, an easy target in a school where respect had to be earned through fear. But sometimes the most ordinary people carry the most extraordinary secrets, and sometimes those secrets have a way of changing everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Lincoln High School in Millbrook, Ohio, creating a steady rhythm that matched Sarah Mitchell's footsteps as she walked down the empty hallway. It was her third week as a substitute teacher, filling in for Mrs. Patterson, who had taken sudden medical leave. The building felt different after hours, quieter, but somehow more ominous, as if the walls themselves remembered every cruel word and petty humiliation that had echoed through these corridors. Sarah pushed her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose and adjusted the stack of papers in her arms. At 42, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. To avoid drawing attention, her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were the kind you'd find in any discount store, functional, forgettable. She had that particular look of substitute teachers everywhere, slightly overwhelmed, perpetually apologetic, desperately trying to maintain order in classrooms, full of students who saw her as nothing more than a placeholder. Lincoln High School had seen better days. The linoleum floors were scuffed and stained, the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, and the lockers bore the scars of countless confrontations. Budget cuts had taken their toll, and the school's reputation had suffered accordingly. It was the kind of place where teachers burned out quickly, where discipline problems were swept under the rug, and where students learned early that the world was divided into predators and prey. Sarah had been assigned to teach freshman English, a particularly challenging group that had already chewed through 2 substitute teachers since the school year began. The regular students had quickly sized her up and found her wanting. She was too soft, too hesitant, too willing to give second chances. In their eyes, she was everything they had learned to despise about weakness, the ringleader of the worst behavior. Was Tyler Brooks, a 16-year-old junior who had been held back twice and seemed determined to make everyone pay for his embarrassment. Tyler came from money. His father owned the largest construction company in Millbrook, and he used that privilege like a weapon. He was tall for his age, with carefully styled blonde hair, and the kind of confident swagger that came from never facing real consequences. His girlfriend, Jessica Chen, was equally ruthless, using her phone to document every humiliation for social media, turning cruelty into content for her growing follower count. Marcus Rivera rounded out their trio, a star athlete who had tied his identity so completely to Tyler's approval that he had forgotten who he was without it. Marcus was actually intelligent, but he had learned that being Tyler's enforcer was easier than thinking for himself. Together, they formed the kind of toxic nucleus that poisoned the entire school environment. From Sarah's very first day, they had targeted her. It started small eye rolls, whispered comments, the occasional paper airplane when her back was turned. But Tyler had an instinct for weakness, and he sensed something in Sarah that made him want to push harder. Maybe it was the way she flinched when students raised their voices, or how she seemed to shrink into herself when confronted with conflict. Whatever it was, it triggered something predatory in him. The harassment escalated gradually. Tyler would ask increasingly personal questions in front of the class, trying to embarrass her. "Miss Mitchell, how come you're not married? Don't you want kids?" Jessica would film these moments, posting them online with mocking captions. Marcus would knock books off her desk, accidentally, and then offer exaggerated apologies that made the whole class laugh. But there was one person in the school who watched these interactions with growing concern. Bob Hayes had been the head janitor at Lincoln High for nearly 30 years. He was in his 60s now, with silver hair and weathered hands that had seen every kind of mess a school could produce. Bob had a way of moving through the building like a ghost, present but largely invisible to the students who saw him as just another fixture. Bob had noticed something about Sarah Mitchell that the others had missed. It was subtle the way she held herself when she thought no one was looking, a certain alertness in her eyes that suggested depths the students couldn't fathom. Sometimes you would catch her staring out the window with an expression that seemed too knowing, too experienced for a simple substitute teacher. There was something familiar about her, something that nagged at the edge of his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. The breaking point came on a cold Friday in November. Sarah had been asked to cover lunch duty, monitoring the cafeteria while the regular staff took their break. The cafeteria was always a powder keg of adolescent energy and social dynamics, and Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach as she watched the students settle into their tribal groups. Tyler's table was positioned strategically. In the center of the room, a throne from which he could survey his kingdom. Jessica sat beside him, her phone perpetually in hand, ready to capture any moment of drama. Marcus lounged across from them, his letterman jacket draped over his chair, like a banner of belonging. Sarah tried to make herself useful, helping younger students open stubborn milk cartons and wiping down tables. But she could feel Tyler's eyes on her, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The cafeteria was fuller than usual, due to the rain keeping students indoors, and the noise level was rising with each passing minute. "Hey, Miss Mitchell," Tyler called out, his voice carrying across the room. "Could you help us with something?" Sarah's instincts screamed danger, but she was trapped by the very politeness that made her such an easy target. She couldn't ignore a student's request for help, even when that student was Tyler Brooks. She approached their table with the careful steps of someone walking into a minefield. "What do you need help with?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Tyler's smile was predatory. "Well, you see, we're doing this science project about temperature and its effects on different materials. We were wondering if you could help us with an experiment." Jessica giggled, her phone already recording. Marcus leaned back in his chair, grinning in anticipation of whatever Tyler had planned. "I'm not sure I understand," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's simple," Tyler continued, his voice taking on a mock-innocent tone. "We need to test how different people react to extreme cold. You know, for science." Before Sarah could respond, Tyler was on his feet, followed immediately by Marcus. They moved with the practiced coordination of predators who had done this before, backing her toward the kitchen area where the staff prepared the school meals. "Please," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I don't think—" "Come on, Miss Mitchell," Jessica chimed in, her phone capturing every moment. "Don't be such a baby. It's just an experiment." Other students had noticed the commotion now, forming a loose circle around the drama. Some looked uncomfortable, but none intervened. This was how it always worked at Lincoln High. The strong preyed on the weak, and everyone else just watched. The kitchen was supposed to be off-limits to students, but Tyler had never been one to follow rules. He pushed through the swinging doors with Sarah stumbling behind him, Marcus blocking any potential escape route. The kitchen was empty during lunch period, the staff having retreated to their break room. In the back corner of the kitchen stood the walk-in freezer, a massive unit that kept the school's food supplies at the proper temperature. It was old and industrial, with a heavy door that required significant force to open. Tyler had been planning this for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Tyler, please," Sarah begged. But her voice was lost in the sudden chaos as Marcus grabbed her arms, while Tyler yanked open the freezer door. "This is going to be so viral," Jessica laughed, her phone capturing every second as they shoved Sarah into the freezer. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. The temperature inside was well below freezing, designed to preserve food, not sustain human life. Sarah stumbled against shelves of frozen vegetables and meat, her cardigan providing no protection against the brutal cold. "Let me out," she screamed, but Tyler was already forcing the door shut. The heavy click of the lock echoed through the darkness, and suddenly Sarah was alone in a frozen tomb. The students outside could hear her pounding on the door, her voice growing increasingly desperate. "Please, I can't breathe in here, let me out." But Tyler was too caught up in his moment of triumph to listen. He high-fived Marcus while Jessica uploaded the video to her social media accounts in real time. "This is going to get so many views," she squealed with delight. Inside the freezer, Sarah's situation was becoming critical. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero, and her body was already beginning to shut down its extremities to preserve core warmth. Her hands were numb, making it impossible to gain any leverage on the door. Her breath came in short, painful gasps that created small clouds in the frigid air. But something was happening to Sarah Mitchell in that frozen darkness. The fear and helplessness that had defined her for weeks was giving way to something else, something harder, more familiar. The cold was brutal, but she had faced worse, much worse. 20 minutes passed before Bob Hayes came looking for her. He had been concerned when he noticed the unusual commotion in the cafeteria, and his janitor's instincts had led him to investigate. He found Tyler and his friends lounging near the kitchen, Jessica still giggling over her phone while Marcus recounted their experiment to a growing crowd of students. "Where's Miss Mitchell?" Bob asked, his voice carrying an authority that made Tyler's smirk falter slightly. "Who knows?" Tyler shrugged, probably crying in some closet somewhere. But Bob was already moving toward the kitchen, his keys jangling at his belt. He had seen this kind of cruelty before, and he knew it never ended well. The kitchen was empty, but he could hear something, a faint tapping, rhythmic and desperate. The freezer door was locked, but Bob had the master key. His hands shook as he turned it, dreading what he might find inside. The door swung open with a rush of frigid air, and there was Sarah Mitchell, huddled in the back corner, her lips blue with cold, but her eyes blazing with something Bob had never seen before. "Are you all right?" he asked, helping her to her feet. Sarah nodded, her jaw clenched to stop her teeth from chattering. "I'm fine," she said, and something in her voice made Bob believe her despite her obvious physical distress. Word of the linoleum incident spread through the school like wildfire. By the time Principal Anderson arrived, half the student body knew what had happened. The video Jessica had posted was already gaining traction online, with comments ranging from cruel laughter to genuine outrage. Principal Anderson was a well-meaning but overwhelmed administrator who had been trying to keep Lincoln High from complete collapse for the better part of a decade. He was 53 years old, with graying hair and the perpetually tired expression of someone fighting a losing battle. When he saw the video, his face went pale. "This is unacceptable," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He had said the same thing about dozens of incidents over the years, and everyone knew that Tyler Brooks was essentially untouchable due to his family's influence in the community. Sarah was taken to the school nurse for evaluation, but she insisted she was fine. She sat in the small medical office, wrapped in blankets, while Principal Anderson paced nervously nearby. The nurse, Mrs. Thompson, wanted to call an ambulance, but Sarah refused. "I just need to warm up," she said quietly. "I'll be fine." But she wasn't fine. Something fundamental had changed in those 20 minutes in the freezer. The woman who had walked into that kitchen was not the same person who had walked out. Sarah Mitchell, the meek substitute teacher, had died in that frozen darkness. What emerged was something else entirely. Principal Anderson called an emergency meeting for Monday morning. All students involved in the incident were to report to the auditorium immediately. Tyler strutted into the building that morning with his usual arrogance, convinced that his family's money would protect him from any real consequences. Jessica was already planning her next viral video, while Marcus wondered if this might finally be the wake-up call he needed to distance himself from Tyler's increasingly dangerous pranks. The auditorium was buzzing with nervous energy as students filed in. Word had spread over the weekend that something big was happening, and the excitement was palpable. Tyler and his friends took their usual seats in the back, ready to treat the whole thing as another joke. Principal Anderson took the stage, his hands visibly shaking as he approached the microphone. "Students," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "we're here to address the serious incident that occurred on Friday afternoon." The crowd stirred restlessly. This wasn't what they had expected. Where was the drama? Where was the spectacle they had been promised? However, Principal Anderson continued, "I'm not the person who should be addressing this situation. We have a special guest with us today, someone who has requested to speak directly to those involved." A murmur ran through the crowd. Special guest? No one had mentioned a special guest. The side door of the auditorium opened, and a woman in an expensive navy suit entered. She was tall, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, and she moved with the kind of confidence that commanded attention. This was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the superintendent of the school district, but her presence seemed to fill the room with an authority that went far beyond her official title. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had expected to face Principal Anderson, maybe get a lecture about bullying, probably walk away with a slap on the wrist. But Dr. Rodriguez was different. She was someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Students," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without need for amplification, "I'm here to discuss Miss Sarah Mitchell." The crowd fell silent. Even Tyler stopped smirking. Some of you may be wondering why. The district superintendent would personally involve herself in what you might consider a simple prank. Dr. Rodriguez continued, "Let me enlighten you." She paused, letting the tension build. "Miss Mitchell has been substitute teaching at your son's school for 3 weeks. In that time, she has endured harassment, humiliation, and ultimately, a criminal assault that could have resulted in her death." Jessica's phone, which had been recording everything, suddenly felt heavy in her hands. "But there's something you don't know about Miss Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the auditorium. "Something that makes your behavior not just cruel, but tragically ironic." The side door opened again, and Sarah Mitchell entered. But this was not the broken, frightened woman who had been shoved into the freezer. This Sarah walked with purpose, her head high, her shoulders straight. She had traded her cardigan for a simple black dress, and her hair was no longer in a ponytail but styled professionally. The transformation was so complete that some students didn't recognize her at first. "Miss Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez said, "would you please tell these students who you really are?" Sarah approached the microphone, her movements fluid and confident. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, nothing like the whispered apologies the students had grown accustomed to. "My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell," she began, and the title hit the room like a thunderbolt. "I have a PhD in educational psychology from Harvard University, and I've spent the last 15 years as the Chief Learning Officer for Morrison Education Group, one of the largest educational consulting firms in the country." The auditorium was dead silent. Tyler's mouth hung open, his arrogance evaporating like morning dew. "I came to Lincoln High not as a desperate substitute teacher, but as part of a comprehensive evaluation of struggling schools in our district," Sarah continued. "I needed to understand the culture, the dynamics, The real reasons why schools like this one continue to fail despite increased funding and resources. She paused, letting her words sink in. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined. I found a toxic environment where cruelty is rewarded, where adults have abdicated their responsibility to protect the vulnerable, and where students have learned that might makes right. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward. Dr. Mitchell's recommendations will determine whether Lincoln High receives the additional funding it desperately needs, or whether the district will be forced to implement more drastic measures. Tyler felt the world spinning around him. The woman he had tormented, the victim of his cruelest prank, held the future of his school in her hands. But more than that, Dr. Rodriguez continued, Dr. Mitchell's experience here has exposed a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored. The video of Friday's incident has been forwarded to the district attorney's office. What you did wasn't just bullying, it was assault, false imprisonment, and reckless endangerment. The color drained from Tyler's face. Jessica's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Marcus looked like he might throw up. Sarah spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. I want you to understand something. I have worked with troubled students for my entire career. I have seen the worst that adolescent cruelty can produce, and I have also seen the incredible capacity for growth and change that exists in young people. She looked directly at Tyler. I know you think you're powerful because your family has money. I know you think you're untouchable because you've never faced real consequences. But power without wisdom is just destruction, and privilege without responsibility is just another form of weakness. The auditorium was so quiet you could hear the rain pattering against the windows. I could have revealed who I was at any time during these 3 weeks, Sarah continued. I could have ended your harassment with a single phone call. But I needed to understand not just what you were doing, but why you were doing it. I needed to see how deep the rot went. She paused, studying the faces of the students before her. What I found was a group of young people who have been failed by the adults in their lives. You've been taught that cruelty is strength, that empathy is weakness, that the only way to feel powerful is to make others feel small. Tyler wanted to look away, but found himself trapped by her gaze. The irony is that while you were trying to break me, you were actually breaking yourselves, Sarah said. Every cruel word, every act of harassment, every moment of deliberate cruelty was making you smaller, weaker, less than who you could be. Dr. Rodriguez took over again. The students directly involved in Friday's incident will face criminal charges. The school's administration will undergo a complete review, and Lincoln High will be placed on probation pending a full investigation of its culture and policies. The consequences hit like a tsunami. Tyler's college prospects, already shaky due to his poor grades, would be completely destroyed by a criminal conviction. Jessica's social media career was over before it had really begun. Marcus faced losing his athletic eligibility and his scholarship opportunities, but Sarah wasn't finished. However, she said, her voice cutting through the panic, I believe in second chances. I believe that people can change, that communities can heal, and that even the cruelest behavior can be transformed into something positive. She looked directly at Tyler again. I'm not here to destroy your lives. I'm here to offer you a choice. You can continue down the path you're on, facing the full legal consequences of your actions, or you can choose to be part of the solution. The room held its breath. I'm proposing a restorative justice program, Sarah continued. Instead of expulsion and criminal charges, the students involved will participate in a year-long program focused on empathy, leadership, and community service. They'll work with younger students who have been victims of bullying. They'll study the psychological impact of harassment, and they'll help develop new policies to prevent this kind of behavior. Tyler's mind raced. It was a lifeline, but it came with conditions that terrified him almost as much as the alternative. The program will be intensive, Sarah warned. It will require you to examine your behavior, acknowledge the harm you've caused, and make real changes to who you are. It will be harder than facing a judge, because it will require you to face yourselves. She looked around the auditorium one final time. The choice is yours. But understand this: if you choose the program and then fail to honor your commitment, the criminal charges will be reinstated with my full support. The meeting ended with students filing out in stunned silence. Tyler sat in his seat long after the auditorium had emptied, staring at the stage where his world had just been turned upside down. Jessica and Marcus flanked him, equally shell-shocked. "What do we do?" Jessica whispered. Tyler didn't answer immediately. For the first time in his life, he was facing consequences that his family's money couldn't make disappear. But more than that, he was confronting the possibility that everything he had believed about himself might be wrong. Over the following weeks, the three students who had seemed so powerful found themselves in a completely different position. Tyler, who had ruled the school through fear and intimidation, was now avoided by the very students who had once sought his approval. Jessica's social media accounts had been deleted after the backlash from her freezer video became too intense to manage. Marcus discovered that his teammates were disgusted by his behavior, and his position on the team was in jeopardy. But slowly, something unexpected began to happen. The restorative justice program that Sarah had proposed began to take shape, and the students involved found themselves confronting not just their actions, but the deeper issues that had driven them to cruelty. In the first place, Tyler discovered that his need to dominate others stemmed from his own feelings of inadequacy and his father's impossible expectations. Jessica realized that her desperate need for online validation had made her complicit in genuinely harmful behavior. Marcus began to understand that his identity as Tyler's enforcer had prevented him from developing any real sense of self. The program wasn't easy. It required them to meet weekly with Sarah, who had agreed to stay on as a consultant, to help implement the changes Lincoln High desperately needed. These sessions were intense, often uncomfortable, forcing the students to confront truths about themselves they had spent years avoiding. But gradually, something remarkable happened. The students who had once been predators began to transform into protectors. Tyler, who had spent years tormenting younger students, found himself intervening when he saw bullying behavior. Jessica channeled her communication skills into creating anti-bullying content that actually helped other students. Marcus discovered that his natural leadership abilities were far more powerful when used to lift others up rather than tear them down. The changes weren't limited to the students directly involved in the program. Word of what had happened spread throughout the school, and the culture began to shift. Students who had been silent witnesses to cruelty began to speak up. Teachers who had felt powerless to address the toxic environment found new support from the administration. Bob Hayes, the janitor who had rescued Sarah from the freezer, was asked to share his observations about the school's culture. His insights, gained from years of moving invisibly through the hallways, proved invaluable in understanding how the toxic dynamics had developed and how they could be changed. 6 months after the freezer incident, Lincoln High was a different place. Test scores were improving, discipline referrals had dropped dramatically, and the school had received national attention for its innovative approach to addressing bullying and creating positive school culture. Tyler Brooks, who had once been the embodiment of everything wrong with the school, became one of its most effective advocates for change. He spoke at conferences about his experience, sharing his story with other schools struggling with similar issues. His college applications, which had seemed doomed, were now strengthened by his genuine transformation and his commitment to making amends for his past behavior. Jessica Chun had discovered that her real talent wasn't in creating viral content that mocked others, but in developing educational materials that helped students understand the impact of their actions. Her anti-bullying campaign, launched from the same social media platforms she had once used to spread cruelty, reached thousands of students across the country. Marcus Rivera had become a peer mediator, using his athletic status and natural charisma to help resolve conflicts before they escalated. His teammates, who had initially been disgusted by his behavior, now looked to him as a leader in creating a more positive team culture. And Sarah Mitchell, the substitute teacher who had endured their worst behavior, had become a national expert on school culture transformation. Her experience at Lincoln High had provided her with insights that no amount of academic study could have delivered. She had learned that sometimes the most important discoveries come from our most difficult experiences. The story of Lincoln High School became a model for other struggling schools, proving that even the most toxic environments could be transformed when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and make difficult changes. It showed that redemption was possible, that people could grow beyond their worst moments, and that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most painful experiences. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that strength isn't about having power over others. It's about having the courage to use whatever power you have to lift others up, to protect the vulnerable, and to create the kind of world where everyone can thrive. Years later, when Tyler Brooks was working as a school counselor, helping other troubled students find their way, he would often think about that cold November day when he thought he was at his most powerful. He would remember the woman in the cardigan who had seemed so weak, so easily broken, and he would marvel at how completely he had misunderstood what real strength looked like. The freezer room at Lincoln High had long since been replaced with a more modern unit, but the lessons learned in that frozen darkness continued to echo through the hallways, reminding everyone that sometimes our greatest defeats can become our most important victories, and that the people we think we can break might actually be the ones who end up saving us. The transformation of Lincoln High School wasn't just about policy changes or new programs. It was about the slow, sometimes painful process of individuals confronting who they had become and deciding who they wanted to be. In the months following Sarah's revelation, the ripple effects of that November day continued to spread through every corner of the school community. Tyler Brooks found himself in a position he had never experienced before: complete social isolation. The same students who had once laughed at his cruel jokes now avoided him in the hallways. His locker, which had once been a gathering place for his followers, stood empty except for his own belongings. The football team, where he had been a bench warmer riding on his father's donations to the program, suddenly found reasons to exclude him from team activities. But the most difficult confrontation came from an unexpected source. Tyler's younger sister, Emma, was a freshman at Lincoln High. She had always idolized her older brother, believing his stories about his popularity and influence at school. When the video of Sarah being locked in the freezer went viral, Emma saw it before the family could intervene. The realization that her hero was actually a bully shattered something fundamental in their relationship. Emma confronted Tyler one evening as he sat in his room, staring at his phone and watching his social media followers disappear one by one. She stood in his doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mixture of disappointment and disgust that cut deeper than any punishment their parents could devise. "How could you do that to someone?" she asked, her voice barely containing her emotion. "She was just trying to teach, and you almost killed her." Tyler looked up from his phone, seeing his sister clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Emma was small for her age, with the same blonde hair as Tyler, but none of his aggressive confidence. She was the kind of student who tried hard, followed rules, and worried about disappointing her teachers. Everything Tyler had learned to despise. "You don't understand," Tyler started, but Emma cut him off. "I understand perfectly," she said. "You're a bully, and now everyone knows it." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Bully. Tyler had never thought of himself that way. In his mind, he was popular, confident, a leader. But seeing himself through Emma's eyes forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. "Emma, he began, but she was already walking away. "Don't," she said without turning back. "Just don't." That night, Tyler lay awake thinking about his sister's words. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, shivering in that freezer, and for the first time, he tried to imagine what that experience had felt like. The fear, the cold, the helplessness. The realization that her life was in the hands of people who saw her suffering as entertainment. Meanwhile, Jessica Chun was facing her own reckoning. The video she had posted of Sarah in the freezer had initially gained traction exactly as she had hoped. Views, likes, shares, comments. For a brief moment, Jessica had felt the rush of viral success. But as the context became clear, as people learned who Sarah really was, the tide turned viciously. Jessica's social media accounts were flooded with comments calling her a monster, a psychopath, a criminal. Her follower count, which she had spent months carefully cultivating, plummeted overnight. Brands that had been considering her for sponsorship deals quietly distanced themselves. The online presence she had built her identity around crumbled in a matter of days. But worse than the public humiliation was the response from her family. Jessica's parents had immigrated from Taiwan when she was young, working multiple jobs to provide opportunities for their children. They had sacrificed everything for Jessica's education, believing that their daughter would use those opportunities to make something meaningful of her life. When Jessica's mother saw the video, she didn't say anything at first. She simply sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded, tears streaming down her face. The disappointment in her eyes was more devastating than any punishment could have been. "We came to this country with nothing," her mother finally said, her English still accented after 20 years. "We worked every day, every night, so you could have chances we never had. And this is what you do with those chances. You hurt people for fun?" Jessica tried to explain about social media, about the pressure to create content, about how she hadn't really thought about the consequences. But her explanation sounded hollow even to her own ears. "In Taiwan, we have saying," her mother continued, "the tree that grows straight reaches toward heaven. The tree that grows crooked falls down and crushes everything around it." Which tree are you, Jessica? Marcus Rivera's crisis was different, but equally profound. As the star running back for the Lincoln High football team, Marcus had built his entire identity around his athletic achievements. He was fast, strong, and talented, enough to attract attention from college scouts. Football wasn't just what he did. It was who he was. When the freezer incident became public, Coach Patterson called Marcus into his office for a conversation that would change everything. Coach Patterson was a man in his 50s who had coached at Lincoln High for over 2 decades. He had seen plenty of talented players come through his program, but he had also seen how quickly talent could be wasted when it wasn't coupled with character. "Sit down, Rivera," Coach Patterson said, not looking up from the paperwork on his desk. Marcus took the chair across from the coach, his stomach churning with anxiety. He had been dreading this conversation since the moment the video went public. 30 years I've been coaching," Coach Patterson began, finally looking up to meet Marcus's eyes. "In that time, I've had players go on to play Division I football, even a couple who made it to the NFL. You know what they all had in common?" Marcus shook his head. "Character," Coach Patterson said. "Talent will get you noticed, but character will determine whether you succeed or fail when the real pressure comes." He leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus carefully. "What you did to that teacher tells me everything I need to know about your character right now, and frankly, it's not good." Marcus felt his world beginning to collapse. "Coach, I can explain." "No," Coach Patterson interrupted. "You can't explain it. There is no explanation for what you did that makes it acceptable. You participated in an assault on a defenseless woman. You stood by and watched while she suffered. You were complicit in behavior that could have killed her." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He had been trying to minimize his role in the incident, telling himself that he had just gone along with Tyler's plan, that he hadn't really been the instigator. But Coach Patterson's stark assessment forced him to confront the reality of his actions. "I'm suspending you from the team, pending the outcome of the legal proceedings," Coach Patterson continued. "And even if those charges are dropped, you'll need to prove to me that you've changed before you'll be welcome back." Marcus felt tears burning his eyes. "Coach, please. Football is everything to me." "No," Coach Patterson said firmly. "Football is not everything to you. Football is what you do. Who you are is what matters, and right now, who you are is someone I don't want representing this program." The conversation ended with Marcus walking out of the coach's office in a daze. The hallways that had once felt like his domain now seemed foreign and hostile. Students who had once congratulated him on his performances now looked at him with disgust or disappointment. Sarah Mitchell, meanwhile, was dealing with her own complex emotions about the situation. The revelation of her true identity had given her power over the students who had tormented her, but using that power responsibly was more challenging than she had anticipated. Sarah had spent her career studying the psychology of adolescent behavior, but experiencing it firsthand had given her insights that no amount of academic research could provide. She understood now why so many anti-bullying programs failed. They focused on the behavior without addressing the underlying psychological needs that drove that behavior. Tyler's cruelty, she realized, stemmed from his desperate need to feel powerful in a world where he felt increasingly powerless. His father's expectations, his academic struggles, his fear of not living up to the family name, all of these pressures had created a young man who could only feel strong by making others feel weak. Jessica's participation came from a different place. She was driven by a hunger for attention and validation that social media had amplified into something dangerous. The dopamine hit of likes and shares had become addictive, and she had lost sight of the real human cost of her content. Marcus was perhaps the most tragic of the three, because his natural instincts were actually protective and kind. But his desperate need to belong, to be accepted by Tyler's inner circle, had overridden his moral compass. He had betrayed his own values in service of a friendship that was ultimately hollow. Understanding the psychology behind their behavior didn't excuse it, but it did provide a roadmap for intervention. Sarah knew that punishment alone would not create lasting change. These students needed to understand not just that their behavior was wrong, but why they had been driven to it in the first place. The restorative justice program that Sarah had proposed was based on this understanding. Rather than simply punishing the students for their actions, it would require them to engage in deep self-reflection and genuine attempts at making amends. The first session of the program took place on a gray December morning in a small conference room at the district office. Sarah sat at one end of a rectangular table, with Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus arranged around the other sides. The room was deliberately neutral, designed to feel more like a counseling session than a courtroom. "Before we begin," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm, "I want to establish some ground rules. This program is voluntary. Each of you has chosen to be here rather than face criminal charges, but that choice comes with obligations." She looked at each student in turn. "You will attend every session. You will participate honestly and openly. You will complete all contingent assignments, even when they make you uncomfortable. And most importantly, you will treat each other and this process with respect." Tyler shifted in his chair, still struggling to reconcile the powerful woman before him with the timid substitute teacher he had tormented. "What exactly are we supposed to do here?" "We're going to talk," Sarah replied. "About what happened, about why it happened, and about how we move forward. But first, I want each of you to tell me about a time when someone made you feel small." The request caught them off guard. They had been expecting lectures about their behavior, perhaps assignments about the harmful effects of bullying. They hadn't expected to be asked about their own experiences as victims. Jessica spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. In middle school, there was this group of girls who made fun of my accent. They would mock the way I pronounced certain words, imitate my parents when they came to school events. They made me feel ashamed of who I was. Marcus nodded slowly. My freshman year, before I made the football team, there were these older guys who would mess with me in the locker room. They would hide my clothes, shove me around, call me names. I felt helpless. Tyler was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenched tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. My dad, he never hits me or anything like that. But he has this way of looking at me when I disappoint him. Like I'm not worth his time, like I'm a failure. Sarah listened without judgment, taking notes but maintaining eye contact with each speaker. How did those experiences make you feel? Angry, Tyler said immediately. Invisible, Jessica added. Powerless, Marcus concluded. Sarah nodded. And what did you want to do with those feelings? Tyler's answer came without hesitation. I wanted to make someone else feel the way they made me feel. The realization hit him like a physical blow. For the first time, Tyler began to understand the connection between his own pain and the pain he had inflicted on others. The cycle of hurt was suddenly visible to him, and he saw his own role in perpetuating it. That's the beginning of understanding, Sarah said gently. Hurt people hurt people. It's one of the most fundamental truths about human behavior. But understanding the cycle doesn't excuse participating in it. It just helps us figure out how to break it. The session continued for 2 hours, with each student gradually opening up about their motivations and experiences. By the end, they were emotionally drained but also strangely relieved. For the first time since the incident, they were talking about it honestly rather than making excuses or deflecting blame. As they prepared to leave, Sarah gave them their first assignment. I want each of you to write a letter to your 8th grade self. Tell that younger version of yourself what you've learned about how pain can turn into cruelty if we're not careful. Due next week. Over the following weeks, the sessions became increasingly intense and revealing. The students were required to research the psychological effects of bullying, to interview victims of harassment, and to develop presentations about the impact of their actions. Tyler's research led him to studies about suicide rates among bullying victims. He read testimonials from teenagers who had attempted to take their own lives rather than face another day of torment. The statistics were staggering, but the personal stories were what really affected him. One story in particular stayed with him. A 15-year-old boy named David had been systematically bullied by a group of classmates who thought it was funny to mock his stutter. The harassment had escalated until David felt he had no choice but to end his life. He survived the attempt, but the trauma had lasting effects on his family and his ability to trust others. Tyler found himself imagining Sarah in that freezer, facing what she might have believed were her final moments. He wondered if she had thought about her family, about things she would never get to do, about how her life was ending because of someone else's cruelty. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable. Jessica's assignment led her to explore the role of social media in amplifying bullying behavior. She discovered research showing how the anonymity and distance of online platforms could make people cruel in ways they would never consider in face-to-face interactions. She also learned about the concept of digital permanence, the way that online content could follow someone forever, creating lasting damage that went far beyond the initial incident. Her video of Sarah had been seen by thousands of people, and even though it had been deleted, copies probably existed somewhere in the digital universe. The realization that she had potentially caused permanent damage to Sarah's reputation and emotional well-being was devastating. Jessica had always thought of her social media activity as harmless fun, but she was beginning to understand the real-world consequences of treating people's pain as entertainment. Marcus's research focused on the bystander effect, the psychological phenomenon that makes people less likely to intervene in emergencies when other people are present. He learned about studies showing how the presence of even one person willing to speak up could dramatically change the outcome of bullying situations. He realized that his silence during the freezer incident had been just as harmful as Tyler's actions or Jessica's recording. By choosing not to intervene, he had become complicit in the assault. His physical strength, which he had always seen as his greatest asset, had been useless because he lacked the moral courage to use it for good. The most difficult part of the program came in January, when Sarah arranged for the students to meet with actual victims of bullying. These weren't statistics or case studies. They were real people who had lived through experiences similar to what Sarah had endured. One of the speakers was a woman named Linda, who had been a teacher for 30 years before retiring early due to harassment from students and lack of support from administration. She spoke about the cumulative effect of daily disrespect, how it had eroded her confidence and her love for teaching. "People think words don't hurt," Linda said, her voice steady but sad. "They think because there are no visible bruises, no broken bones, that the damage isn't real. But psychological wounds can take much longer to heal than physical ones." Another speaker was a recent graduate named Alex, who had been the target of cyberbullying throughout high school. Alex spoke about the way the harassment had followed them home through social media, making it impossible to escape even in what should have been safe spaces. "The worst part wasn't even the things they said about me," Alex explained. "It was the way it made me doubt myself. I started to believe maybe they were right, maybe I was worthless. It took years of therapy to understand that their cruelty said nothing about me and everything about them." Listening to these stories, Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus began to understand the full scope of harm they had caused. It wasn't just about 20 minutes in a freezer. It was about the message they had sent to every student who witnessed their behavior, that cruelty was acceptable, that might made right, that some people deserved to be treated as less than human. The most powerful moment came when Linda looked directly at Tyler and said, "I want you to understand something. The teacher you hurt in that freezer, she'll carry that experience with her for the rest of her life. Every time she walks into a new classroom, part of her will remember what you did. That's the real cost of your actions." Tyler felt something break inside him at those words. For months, he had been focused on his own consequences, his ruined reputation, his legal troubles, his family's disappointment. But hearing Linda speak made him realize that his actions had created lasting trauma for another human being, and that was a responsibility he would carry forever. After the victim speakers left, the three students sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Jessica spoke up. "I feel sick," she said simply. Marcus nodded. "I keep thinking about all the times I could have said something, could have stopped it, and I just didn't." Tyler was quiet for a long time before speaking. "I don't know how to live with this," he said finally. "How do you live with knowing you've caused this kind of pain?" Sarah, who had been observing the session quietly, finally spoke. "You live with it by making sure it never happens again. You live with it by using your experience to help others. You live with it by becoming the kind of person who stands up for others instead of tearing them down." She paused, studying their faces. "The guilt you're feeling right now? That's not punishment. That's conscience. It's the part of you that knows right from wrong reasserting itself. The question is what you're going to do with it." As winter turned to spring, the three students began to change in ways that surprised. Even Sarah, Tyler, who had once dominated through intimidation, began using his social status to intervene when he saw bullying behavior. When he witnessed upperclassmen harassing a younger student, he stepped in firmly but without cruelty. "That's not cool," he would say simply, and his reputation for unpredictable behavior made students listen. Word spread that Tyler Brooks had changed, and while some students remained skeptical, others began to see him differently. Jessica channeled her social media skills into creating content, that promoted kindness and empathy. She started a campaign called Before You Post, encouraging students to think about the real human beings behind the screen names and profile pictures. Her follower count never recovered to its previous levels, but the engagement was more meaningful. Marcus became a peer mediator, using his athletic status to bridge divides between different social groups. His teammates, initially suspicious of his transformation, gradually came to respect his new perspective. Coach Patterson, who had been watching Marcus's progress carefully, eventually allowed him to rejoin the team with the understanding that he was now a leader responsible for team culture. But the most significant change was in their relationship with each other. The three students who had once bonded over their cruelty toward others began to develop genuine friendship based on their shared commitment to change. They met regularly, outside of the formal program sessions, supporting each other through the difficult process of confronting their past behavior and building new identities. When Tyler struggled with anger management, Jessica and Marcus were there to help him find healthier outlets. When Jessica faced backlash from former friends who accused her of being fake, Tyler and Marcus defended her growth as genuine. The transformation wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old patterns of behavior threatened to reassert themselves. But each time they stumbled, they had the support of their group and the guidance of Sarah to help them get back on track. By the end of the school year, Lincoln High School was a fundamentally different place. The toxic culture that had enabled the freezer incident had been replaced by something healthier, though still fragile. Students were more likely to speak up when they witnessed bullying. Teachers felt more empowered to address behavioral issues, and the administration had implemented policies that actually supported positive change. The transformation wasn't complete. Changing school culture is a long-term process that requires constant vigilance. But the foundation had been laid for something better, something that honored the dignity of every person who walked through those hallways. Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus graduated with their class, but their education in empathy and responsibility continued. Tyler went on to study education, determined to become the kind of teacher who could prevent other students from making his mistakes. Jessica pursued a degree in communications with a focus on ethical media practices. Marcus combined his athletic abilities with his newfound leadership skills, earning a scholarship to play football while studying social work. And Sarah Mitchell, the substitute teacher who had endured their worst behavior and responded with wisdom rather than vengeance, continued her work of transforming schools and lives. The freezer incident at Lincoln High became a case study in her consulting work, an example of how even the most toxic situations could become opportunities for growth and redemption. The story of those 20 minutes in a freezer room had ended, but the story of the lives that were changed because of it was just beginning. 5 years had passed since that bitter November day when 3 students locked their substitute teacher in a freezer room, never imagining that their victim would become their salvation. The ripple effects of that single incident continued to spread far beyond the walls of Lincoln High School, touching lives in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium of the National Education Conference in Denver, looking out at an audience of over 2,000 educators, administrators, and policymakers. Her presentation, titled "From Crisis to Transformation: How Restorative Justice Can Heal School Communities," had drawn one of the largest crowds of the conference. But as she prepared to speak, her mind drifted back to a much smaller room where 3 broken teenagers had first learned what it meant to face the consequences of their actions. The story she was about to tell had become legendary in education circles, not because of its sensational elements, but because of its profound demonstration that even the most damaged relationships could be repaired with patience, wisdom, and genuine commitment to change. What had started as a nightmare had evolved into a model for educational transformation that was being implemented in schools across the country. Sarah's work had taken her far from the modest hallways of Lincoln High. She now directed the Center for Educational Healing at Stanford University, a research institute dedicated to developing innovative approaches to conflict resolution in schools. Her team studied everything from playground disputes to serious criminal behavior, always searching for ways to turn destructive moments into opportunities for growth. But the Lincoln High case remained special to her, not just because it had launched her national reputation, but because it had taught her something crucial about human nature. People could change, genuinely and permanently, if they were given the right combination of accountability, support, and hope. Meanwhile, Tyler Brooks was discovering just how difficult it was to earn redemption in the real world. Now 23, and in his final year of graduate school at Ohio State University, Tyler was student teaching at a middle school in Columbus. His supervising teacher, Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez, was a veteran educator who had heard whispers about Tyler's past, but had decided to judge him by his current actions rather than his former mistakes. Tyler's classroom management style was unlike anything Mrs. Rodriguez had seen from a student teacher. Where most new educators struggled to maintain authority, Tyler had an almost uncanny ability to diffuse conflicts before they escalated. He seemed to sense when a student was having a bad day, when peer pressure was building toward cruelty, when a joke was about to cross the line into harassment. One afternoon, Mrs. Rodriguez watched Tyler intervene in a situation that could have turned ugly. Two eighth-grade boys, Jake and Manuel, had been engaged in an escalating conflict over a girl. Jake, who was popular and athletic, had been publicly mocking Manuel's attempts to ask the girl to the spring dance. The teasing had attracted an audience, and Manuel's face was red with humiliation and rage. Tyler appeared beside them as if from nowhere, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the situation. "Jake, can I talk to you for a second?" he said quietly, his tone neither threatening nor pleading. Something in Tyler's voice made Jake pause. Maybe it was the way Tyler looked at him, not with judgment, but with understanding. "Whatever," Jake muttered, but he followed Tyler a few steps away from the crowd. "I get it," Tyler said, keeping his voice low enough that only Jake could hear. "You're trying to look cool in front of your friends. But think about this. How do you want people to remember you? As the guy who built himself up by tearing others down, or as someone who was actually strong enough to be kind?" Jake's defensive posture softened slightly. "He's just so weird, though. Always reading those comic books and talking about stuff nobody cares about." "Yeah, he's different," Tyler acknowledged. "But different doesn't mean wrong. And making him feel terrible about who he is doesn't make you any cooler. It just makes you cruel." Tyler paused, letting his words sink in. "Look, I'm not going to lecture you about bullying. You've heard all that before. But I will say this. The way you treat people when you think it doesn't matter is exactly the kind of person you're becoming. And once you become that person, it's really hard to change." There was something in Tyler's voice, a weight of experience that made Jake actually listen. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you have a choice right now," Tyler replied. "You can keep going down this path or you can be better. But the choice is yours, and whatever you decide, you'll have to live with it." Jake looked back at Manuel, who was still standing awkwardly by his locker, and then at the group of students who were clearly waiting for the drama to continue. For a moment, Mrs. Rodriguez thought Jake might choose the path of least resistance and continue his harassment. But then something shifted in his expression. Jake walked back to Manuel, and the crowd leaned in, expecting the confrontation to escalate. Instead, Jake surprised everyone. "Hey Manuel, sorry about giving you a hard time. Good luck with asking Sarah to the dance." The anticlimactic ending disappointed the crowd, but Tyler saw something more significant in Jake's choice. It was a small moment of moral courage, the kind that could grow into something larger if nurtured properly. Later, Mrs. Rodriguez pulled Tyler aside. "How did you know exactly what to say to him?" Tyler was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. "I guess I recognize something familiar," he said finally. "Sometimes the kids who are the cruelest are the ones who are most afraid of being vulnerable themselves." Mrs. Rodriguez studied Tyler's face, seeing layers of meaning in his words that went deeper than typical student-teacher wisdom. She had been teaching for 25 years, and she had developed an instinct for recognizing when someone was speaking from personal experience rather than textbook knowledge. "You know," she said carefully, "I've heard some rumors about your past. Nothing specific, just whispers that you weren't always the person you are now." Tyler felt his stomach clench. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing that eventually his past would catch up with him. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that suggest you understand these kids so well because you used to be one of them," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "The kind that makes me wonder if your commitment to preventing bullying comes from personal experience with being on the wrong side of it." Tyler looked down at his hands, struggling with how much to share. His past felt like a shadow that followed him everywhere, a constant reminder of who he used to be. But he had learned in the restorative justice program that secrets had power only when they were hidden. "You're right," he said quietly. "I did some terrible things when I was in high school. Hurt someone really badly. Almost destroyed several lives, including my own." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "And now? Now I spend every day trying to make sure no other kid makes the mistakes I made," Tyler said. "I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can prevent someone else from going down that path." "That's why you're so good at this," Mrs. Rodriguez realized. "You're not just teaching from a curriculum. You're teaching from your scars." Jessica Chun was facing her own challenges in rebuilding her life and career. Now 23 and working as a digital content specialist for a nonprofit organization focused on cyberbullying prevention, Jessica had found a way to use her social media expertise for positive change. But the transition hadn't been easy. Her organization, called Digital Dignity, created educational content about online harassment and provided resources for victims of cyberbullying. Jessica's role involved developing social media campaigns that reached millions of teenagers, teaching them about digital citizenship and the real-world consequences of online behavior. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her days trying to prevent the kind of behavior she had once engaged in. Every campaign she created, every video she produced, every workshop she facilitated was in some way an attempt to atone for that moment when she had pointed her phone at a suffering woman and seen only an opportunity for viral content. One of her most successful campaigns was called Behind the Screen, which featured real stories from people who had been victims of online harassment. The videos showed not just the immediate impact of cyberbullying, but the long-term effects on mental health, relationships, and life trajectories. Jessica had wanted to include her own story in the campaign, to talk about her experience as a perpetrator who had found redemption, but her supervisor had advised against it. "Your past could overshadow the message," he had warned. "Let the focus stay on the victims and the solutions." But Jessica struggled with the decision to keep her background hidden. She understood the practical concerns, but part of her felt that sharing her journey from perpetrator to advocate could be powerful for other young people who were making harmful choices online. The dilemma came to a head during a workshop she was facilitating at a high school in Portland. A group of students had been particularly resistant to the anti-cyberbullying message, arguing that online harassment was just part of digital culture and that people needed to develop thicker skin. "It's not even real," one student argued. "It's just the internet. If people can't handle it, they shouldn't be online." Jessica felt her professional composure slipping as she listened to arguments that sounded exactly like the rationalizations she had once used. "It is real," she said firmly. "The person behind that screen name, behind that profile picture, is a real human being with real feelings and a real life that can be destroyed by your actions." "How would you know?" The student shot back. "You're just some adult trying to tell us how to use technology you don't even understand." For a moment, Jessica stood at a crossroads. She could maintain her professional distance, stick to the prepared talking points, and hope that her message would somehow break through their cynicism. Or she could take a risk and share the truth about her own experience. "You're right," she said, sitting down so she was at eye level with the students. "I am an adult. But I wasn't always someone who cared about digital dignity. When I was your age, I was exactly the kind of person this program is designed to reach." The room grew quiet, sensing that something important was about to happen. "When I was 16, I made a video of someone being physically assaulted and humiliated," Jessica continued, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the words. "I posted it online because I thought it would get me views and followers. I didn't think about the person I was hurting. I didn't consider that my actions could have lasting consequences. I just saw an opportunity to create content that would make me popular." The students were leaning forward now, their cynicism replaced by genuine attention. "The person in that video could have died because of what happened to her," Jessica said. "And I stood there with my phone, recording her suffering, thinking only about how many likes I might get." She paused, letting the weight of her confession settle in the room. "I learned later that the woman I helped torment was actually one of the most accomplished people I had ever met. But even if she had been nobody special, even if she had been exactly what I thought she was, she still deserved basic human dignity. And I took that away from her for the sake of a few minutes of viral fame." One of the students, a girl who had been particularly dismissive earlier, raised her hand tentatively. "What happened to you? Did you get in trouble?" "Yes, I got in trouble," Jessica said. "But more importantly, I got help. I was given a chance to understand the impact of my actions and to make amends. It took years of work to become someone I could be proud of, and I still carry the weight of what I did." Another student asked, "Do you regret making the video?" "Every single day," Jessica replied without hesitation. "But I've learned that regret without action is just self-pity. The only way to honor the pain I caused is to spend my life trying to prevent other people from making the same mistakes." The workshop continued for another hour, but the dynamic had completely changed. Students who had been resistant were now asking thoughtful questions about digital empathy and online responsibility. Several approached Jessica afterward to share their own experiences with cyberbullying, both as perpetrators and victims. Marcus Rivera was pursuing his own path to redemption through athletics and social work. Now a senior at Ohio University, Marcus had earned a full scholarship playing football while studying for his degree in social work. His transformation from follower to leader had been perhaps the most dramatic of the three, because it had required him to completely reimagine his relationship with power and belonging. Marcus's reputation on the football team was built not on his athletic ability alone, but on his role as a mentor and protector of younger players. He had become known for intervening when hazing threatened to cross the line into abuse, for supporting teammates who were struggling academically or personally, and for creating an inclusive team culture where everyone felt valued. His position as team captain had come with responsibilities that went far beyond calling plays and motivating players. Marcus understood that he was setting the tone for how the team treated each other and how they represented the university in the community. One of the most challenging situations Marcus had faced came during his junior year, when a group of senior players had decided to initiate the freshman class with increasingly dangerous pranks. The tradition had been going on for years, with each class trying to outdo the previous one in terms of creativity and intensity. Marcus had participated in similar rituals when he was a freshman, though they had been relatively mild compared to what the current seniors were planning. But his experience with restorative justice had given him a different perspective on the relationship between tradition and harm. The breaking point came when Marcus learned that the seniors were planning to lock the freshmen in the equipment storage room overnight as part of their initiation. The parallels to his own experience at Lincoln High were too obvious to ignore. "We can't do this," Marcus told the other team captains during a leadership meeting. "Come on, Rivera," said Jake Morrison, the starting quarterback and unofficial leader of the hazing tradition. "It's just for one night. They'll be fine. We all went through it." "No," Marcus said firmly. "We didn't all go through it. And even if we had, that wouldn't make it right." The room erupted in protests and arguments about team tradition and character building. Marcus listened to the same kinds of rationalizations he had once used to justify his own participation in cruelty. "Look," he said when the room quieted. "Down. I know you think this is about toughening them up, about making them part of the team. But what we're really doing is teaching them that belonging requires accepting abuse. And that's not the kind of team I want to be part of." Jake rolled his eyes. "Since when did you become such a bleeding heart? You were fine with this stuff." "When you were younger, you're right," Marcus acknowledged. "I was fine with it. And that was my mistake. But I've learned some things since then about what real leadership looks like." He stood up, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Real leadership isn't about proving you can hurt people and get away with. It's about protecting the people who are vulnerable and creating an environment where everyone can succeed." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with Marcus ultimately threatening to report the planned hazing to the coaching staff if it proceeded. His intervention prevented the incident, but it also created tension within the team leadership that took months to resolve. The freshmen never knew how close they had come to spending a terrifying night locked in a storage room, but Marcus's teammates gradually came to respect his moral courage. Some initially saw him as a traitor to team tradition, but others began to understand that his refusal to participate in harmful behavior actually made the team stronger. Coach Williams, who had been coaching college football for over 30 years, took notice of Marcus's leadership style. During a private meeting, he asked Marcus about his approach to team dynamics. "You handle these situations differently than most captains I've worked with," Coach Williams observed. "Most players your age are either trying to prove how tough they are or trying to avoid conflict altogether. But you seem to have a real understanding of how to lead with principle." Marcus considered how much to share about his background. He had been careful not to broadcast his past mistakes, but he had never hidden them when directly asked. "I learned the hard way that there's a difference between being strong and being cruel," Marcus said. "And I learned that real courage isn't about what you can do to someone weaker than you. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to protect them." Coach Williams studied Marcus's face, recognizing the weight of experience in his words. "Sounds like there's a story behind that wisdom." "There is," Marcus replied. "And it's not a story I'm proud of. But it's one that taught me everything I needed to know about the kind of person I want to be." The transformation of Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus hadn't gone unnoticed by Sarah Mitchell. She had kept in touch with all three of them over the years, not as their supervisor or counselor, but as someone who had a unique investment in their continued growth. Sarah's work at Stanford had expanded far beyond her original research into school bullying. She now studied organizational culture more broadly, working with corporations, government agencies, and community organizations to help them address toxic dynamics and build healthier environments. But the principles she applied in her consulting work had been forged in that small conference room where three teenagers had first learned to confront their own capacity for cruelty. Every intervention she designed, every training program she developed, every research study she conducted was informed by the lessons learned during those difficult months at Lincoln High. One of her most significant achievements had been the development of the Lincoln model of restorative justice, which had been implemented in over 200 schools across 15 states. The model was unique in its emphasis on long-term transformation rather than short-term compliance. and its success rate in preventing repeat offenses was significantly higher than traditional disciplinary approaches. The Lincoln model required participants to engage in deep self-reflection, to understand the root causes of their behavior, and to make meaningful amends to their victims and communities. But it also provided the support and guidance necessary for genuine change, recognizing that punishment without rehabilitation often led to escalation rather than improvement. Sarah often spoke at conferences about the theoretical foundations of the program, but she rarely shared the personal details of its origin. The story of the freezer incident had become somewhat mythologized in education circles, with various versions circulating that often bore little resemblance to the actual events. It wasn't until the 5-year anniversary of the incident that Sarah decided to tell the complete story publicly. She was invited to deliver the keynote address at the National Conference on School Safety, and she knew that this was her opportunity to honor not just the victims of bullying, but also the perpetrators who had found the courage to change. Auditorium in Denver was packed beyond capacity, with attendees sitting in the aisles and standing along the walls. Sarah's reputation as both a researcher and a practitioner had made her one of the most sought-after speakers in her field. As Sarah looked out at the audience, she thought about Tyler in his classroom in Columbus, patiently teaching a group of middle school students about empathy and respect. She thought about Jessica in Portland, using her digital expertise to protect vulnerable young people from online harassment. She thought about Marcus at Ohio University, modeling leadership that prioritized protection over domination. 5 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, I was locked in a freezer by 3 students who saw me as nothing more than an easy target for their cruelty. Today, those same 3 people are among the most effective advocates for kindness and dignity that I have ever known. The audience stirred with recognition. Many had heard fragments of this story, but few knew the complete narrative or its ultimate resolution. I want to tell you about that day, Sarah continued. Not because the incident itself was unique, sadly. Educators face harassment and violence far too often, but because of what happened next. Because the story of how we responded to that crisis became a template for transformation that has changed thousands of lives. For the next 45 minutes, Sarah told the complete story of the freezer incident and its aftermath. She spoke about the initial horror and humiliation, about the difficult decision to offer restorative justice rather than pursuing maximum punishment, and about the long, challenging process of helping 3 young people confront the worst parts of themselves. But most importantly, she spoke about the profound truth that had emerged from that experience, that people are not defined by their worst moments, but by what they choose to do after those moments have passed. Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus were not bad people, Sarah concluded. They were young people who had learned to use cruelty as a tool for managing their own pain and insecurity. When we gave them better tools and showed them a different path, they chose to walk it, even when that path was difficult and uncertain. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Sarah knew that the real measure of her message's impact would come in the days and weeks that followed, as educators returned to their schools and communities with new understanding of what was possible when crisis was met with wisdom rather than vengeance. After the conference, Sarah received hundreds of emails from teachers, administrators, and students who had been inspired by the story. But the message that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. It was a simple text from Tyler. Watched your speech online. Thank you for saving my life. Similar messages arrived from Jessica and Marcus over the following days, each expressing gratitude not just for the second chance they had been given, but for the ongoing support that had made their transformation possible. 5 years after that terrible day in November, the story of the freezer incident had become something larger than any of them had imagined. It had become proof that even the most broken relationships could be repaired, that even the cruelest behavior could be transformed, and that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the hard work of change. The ripple effects continued to spread, touching lives in ways that none of them would ever fully know. Students who had witnessed Tyler's intervention with Jake would carry that model of moral courage into their own futures. Young people who saw Jessica's campaign videos would think twice before posting cruel content online. Athletes who played alongside Marcus would understand that true strength came from protection, not domination. And in schools across the country, educators who had heard Sarah's story would remember that their most challenging students might also be their greatest opportunities for transformation. The freezer that had once been a symbol of cruelty had become a metaphor for the possibility of change, proving that even in the coldest, darkest moments, the seeds of redemption could still take root and grow. 10 years had elapsed since that frigid November afternoon when 3 high school students made a choice that would redefine the trajectory of multiple lives. The Lincoln High School building still stood in Millbrook, Ohio, but everything else about the institution had been transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a struggling school, known for its toxic culture, had become a beacon of hope, attracting educators and researchers from around the world who wanted to understand how such profound change was possible. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken years of deliberate effort, countless setbacks, and the sustained commitment of people who refused to accept that failure was inevitable. But the results spoke for themselves. Lincoln High now boasted one of the highest graduation rates in the state. College acceptance rates had tripled, and perhaps most importantly, surveys showed that students felt safe, valued, and supported in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Principal Anderson, who had once seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of his school's problems, had evolved into a nationally recognized leader in educational reform. He often spoke at conferences about the importance of addressing school culture holistically, understanding that academic achievement was impossible without emotional safety. His office walls were now lined with awards and recognition letters, but the item he treasured most was a simple framed photo from the first Kindness Week celebration at Lincoln High, showing hundreds of students wearing T-shirts that read, "We Rise Together." The annual Kindness Week had become one of Lincoln High's most cherished traditions, but few current students knew its origins. The event had been started by a group of seniors who wanted to honor the memory of a traumatic incident that had ultimately led to healing. They didn't know the specific details of what had happened in the cafeteria freezer all those years ago, but they understood that their school's current culture of mutual respect and support had been born from a moment of profound crisis. Tyler Brooks stood at the front of his own classroom now, no longer a student teacher, but a fully certified educator with 6 years of experience. At 28, he had become one of the youngest department heads in his district, overseeing the social studies curriculum for 3 middle schools in the Columbus area. His approach to teaching had gained attention not just for its effectiveness in improving test scores, but for its remarkable ability to reach students who had been written off by other educators. Tyler's classroom was a sanctuary for kids who didn't fit the traditional mold. The walls were covered with student artwork, inspirational quotes, and photos from various field trips and community service projects. But the most prominent display was a bulletin board titled "Second Chances," where students could anonymously share stories about times they had been forgiven or had chosen to forgive others. On this particular morning, Tyler was preparing for what he considered one of his most important lessons of the year. He called it the ripple effect, and it focused on how individual choices, both positive and negative, could impact entire communities across generations. It was a lesson he had been refining for years, drawing on research in social psychology, case studies from history, and most powerfully, his own lived experience. "Who can tell me what a ripple effect is?" Tyler asked his 8th grade class as they settled into their seats. A student named Marcus raised his hand. Tyler had been working with this particular student for months, trying to help him understand that his quick temper and tendency toward aggression were holding him back from his considerable potential. "It's like when you throw a rock in a pond, and the waves spread out," Marcus answered. "Exactly," Tyler said, moving to the whiteboard where he had drawn concentric circles. "Now, imagine that instead of a rock, we're talking about a choice someone makes, a decision to help someone or hurt them. How might that choice create ripples?" The discussion that followed was one of those magical teaching moments when abstract concepts suddenly became concrete and personal. Students began sharing examples from their own lives, talking about teachers who had believed in them when others hadn't, friends who had stood up for them during difficult times, and unfortunately, moments when cruelty had cascaded through their social groups like a contagion. Tyler listened carefully to each story, occasionally asking follow-up questions that helped students dig deeper into the long-term consequences of the situations they were describing. He had learned that young people were often intensely interested in moral questions, but they needed frameworks for thinking about ethics that felt relevant to their daily experience. "I want to tell you about a choice that was made 10 years ago," Tyler said when the discussion had reached a natural pause. It was a choice that seemed small at the time, just 20 minutes out of someone's life, but it ended up changing the lives of thousands of people. The room grew quiet. Tyler's students had learned to recognize when he was about to share something important, and they knew that his stories always contained lessons that went beyond the curriculum. There was a student, not much older than you are now, who thought that hurting someone weaker than him would make him feel powerful, Tyler began. He convinced 2 friends to help him lock their substitute teacher in a freezer room as a prank. They thought it was funny. They thought it would make them popular. Tyler paused, studying the faces of his students. He could see some of them beginning to shift uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing echoes of their own behavior in the story. "The teacher could have died in that freezer," Tyler continued. "And even though she survived, the experience traumatized her and could have destroyed her faith in young people forever." The students involved faced serious consequences, including possible criminal charges that could have ruined their futures. A student named Sarah raised her hand tentatively. "What happened to them?" Tyler smiled slightly. "That's where the story gets interesting. The teacher they had hurt made a choice that no one expected. Instead of demanding the harshest possible punishment, she offered them something different. She offered them a chance to understand what they had done and to make amends for it." He moved closer to his students, his voice becoming more personal. It wasn't easy. The students had to confront some very uncomfortable truths about themselves. They had to understand how their own pain had led them to cause pain for others. They had to learn empathy, often for the first time in their lives. Tyler paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. But they took that chance. They did the hard work of changing. And because they changed, they were able to help other people change. One of them became a teacher who now helps prevent bullying. Another works to protect people from online harassment. The third became a leader who uses his influence to create safe spaces for others. Marcus, the student who had answered the earlier question about ripples, was listening intently. "How do you know all this? Did you read about it somewhere?" Tyler looked directly at Marcus, seeing so much of his younger self in the boy's aggressive posture and defensive attitude. "I know because I was that student in the freezer story. I was the one who made the choice to hurt someone I thought was weak, and I was also the one who was given the chance to become something better." The revelation hit the classroom like a thunderbolt. Students who had been listening with detached interest suddenly understood that their teacher wasn't just telling them a story, he was sharing his deepest shame and his greatest triumph. "Mr. Brooks," Sarah said quietly, "you really did that. You locked someone in a freezer?" "Yes," Tyler said simply. "I did. And it was the worst thing I've ever done. But it was also the beginning of the best thing I've ever done, which was learning how to be the kind of person who protects others instead of hurting them." The questions came in a flood after that. Students wanted to know about the teacher who had forgiven him, about the process of making amends, about how he had found the courage to change. Tyler answered each question honestly, sharing details about his journey that he had never discussed so openly with students before. But the most important question came from Marcus, whose own struggles with anger and aggression had been a constant source of concern for Tyler. Do you think anyone can change? Even someone who's done really bad things? Tyler knelt down beside Marcus's desk, meeting the boy's eyes directly. I think anyone who genuinely wants to change and is willing to do the work can transform their life, but it's not easy, and it's not quick. It requires facing the truth about yourself, even when that truth is painful. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes, Marcus. We all have. The question is what you're going to do about those mistakes. Are you going to let them define you, or are you going to use them as stepping stones to become someone better? 300 miles away, Jessica Chun was preparing for the most important presentation of her career. Now 28 and the director of digital ethics at a major technology company, Jessica was about to address the company's board of directors about the need for more aggressive policies to combat online harassment and hate speech. The irony of her position wasn't lost on her. The woman who had once gleefully recorded someone suffering for social media content was now one of the industry's leading voices for responsible technology use. Her transformation from perpetrator to protector had given her unique insights into both the mechanisms of online cruelty and the interventions that could prevent it. Jessica's presentation that day included data from multiple studies, showing the correlation between online harassment and real-world violence. Case studies of young people whose lives had been destroyed by cyberbullying, and most importantly, evidence that proactive intervention could dramatically reduce harmful behavior on digital platforms. But as she stood before the board of directors, Jessica knew that statistics and research, however compelling, would not be enough to drive the kind of systemic change that was needed. She had learned from her years in advocacy that lasting change came from stories that helped people understand the human cost of inaction. I want to tell you about a video that was posted online 10 years ago. Jessica began, her voice steady despite the difficulty of what she was about to share. It showed a woman being physically assaulted and humiliated by a group of young people. The video went viral not because people were outraged by the cruelty, but because they found it entertaining. The boardroom was silent, the executives giving Jessica their full attention. That video destroyed relationships, damaged reputations, and traumatized everyone involved. But perhaps most tragically, it represented a culture where human suffering had become content, where someone's worst moment could be commodified for likes and shares. Jessica paused, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. I know this story intimately because I was the person who made that video. I was 16 years old, and I thought that capturing someone else's pain would make me popular online. The admission created a palpable shift in the room's energy. These were executives who were used to discussing digital ethics in abstract terms, but Jessica's personal revelation made the stakes suddenly concrete and immediate. The woman in that video could have sued me, could have pressed charges that would have destroyed my future before it began. Instead, she chose to teach me about the real-world impact of digital cruelty. She helped me understand that behind every screen name, every profile picture, every viral moment, there is a real human being whose life can be permanently altered by our online choices. Jessica went on to describe the restorative justice process that had transformed her understanding of technology's power and responsibility. She spoke about the victims of cyberbullying she had interviewed, the families destroyed by online harassment campaigns, and the young people who had taken their own lives rather than face another day of digital torment. We have the power to change this, Jessica concluded. We can build platforms that promote empathy instead of exploitation, that reward kindness instead of cruelty, that recognize the humanity in every user instead of treating them as content sources or engagement. Metrics. The board's response was immediate and unanimous. Within weeks, Jessica's company had implemented the most comprehensive anti-harassment policies in the industry, setting a new standard that other platforms would eventually follow. Meanwhile, Marcus Rivera was facing the biggest challenge of his professional career. Now 28 and working as a social worker in inner-city Cleveland, Marcus had been assigned to a case that felt uncomfortably familiar. 3 high school students had been arrested for assaulting a homeless veteran, filming the attack, and posting it online as part of a social media challenge. The parallels to his own past were unavoidable, but Marcus recognized that his personal experience, however painful, gave him unique qualifications for working with these young people. He understood the mindset that could lead teenagers to see cruelty as entertainment, and he knew firsthand the process of transformation that was possible if they could be reached in time. Marcus's first meeting with the 3 students, Devin, Aaliyah, and Chris, took place in a stark conference room at the Juvenile Detention Center. They slouched in their chairs with the practiced indifference of young people who had learned that showing emotion was a sign of weakness. "So you're here to lecture us about being good little citizens?" Devin said with a sneer. "Save your breath. We've heard it all before." Marcus studied the young man's defensive posture, recognizing the bravado that barely concealed deep insecurity and pain. "Actually, I'm here to tell you about the worst thing I ever did," Marcus said calmly, "and about what happened after." The unexpected response caught the students off guard. They had been prepared for moral lectures and legal threats, not personal confessions. "When I was your age, I helped lock my substitute teacher in a freezer room," Marcus continued. "We thought it was funny. We thought it made us look tough. We posted video of it online and watched it go viral." Aaliyah shifted in her chair, her indifference beginning to crack. "What happened to you?" "We almost destroyed someone's life," Marcus said simply. "And we almost destroyed our own lives in the process. But we were given something that most people in our situation don't get, a second chance, and the support to make the most of it." Over the following hour, Marcus shared the details of his transformation, from follower to leader, from someone who used his strength to intimidate others to someone who used it to protect the vulnerable. He spoke about the restorative justice process, the difficult work of confronting his own motivations and choices, and the ongoing responsibility he felt to make amends for his past behavior. But most importantly, he spoke about the possibility of redemption, about the fact that their worst moments didn't have to define their futures if they were willing to do the work of change. "The veteran you attacked," Marcus said, looking directly at Devin, "he served his country and ended up on the streets through a combination of mental illness, addiction, and a system that failed him. Instead of seeing someone who deserved help, you saw someone you could hurt without consequences." Devin's defensive mask was beginning to slip, revealing the uncertainty and fear underneath. "He was just some crazy homeless guy." "No," Marcus said firmly. "He was a human being who deserved dignity and respect. And the fact that you couldn't see, that tells me something important about what you've been taught about power and worth." The conversation continued for several more sessions, with Marcus gradually helping the 3 students understand the connection between their own experiences of powerlessness and their choice to victimize someone even more vulnerable than themselves. It was slow, difficult work, but Marcus could see small signs of progress in their growing willingness to ask questions and their decreasing reliance on defensive posturing. The breakthrough came during their 4th session, when Chris broke down crying while talking about his own experiences of being bullied, and how those experiences had made him want to hurt others. "I just wanted to feel strong for once," he sobbed. "I wanted to be the one with the power." Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand that feeling. But real strength isn't about having power over other people. It's about having the courage to use whatever power you have to lift others up, to protect people who can't protect themselves. Meanwhile, Dr. Sarah Mitchell was preparing for what would be her final public appearance before retiring from active speaking. At 52, she had spent the better part of a decade traveling the world, sharing the lessons learned from that transformative experience at Lincoln High School. Her work had influenced education policy in dozens of countries and had helped establish restorative justice programs in thousands of schools. The venue for her farewell address was fitting, the auditorium at Lincoln High School, the same space where she had first revealed her true identity to Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus 10 years earlier. The event was being broadcast live to education conferences around the world, with an estimated audience of over 50,000 educators, administrators, and policymakers. But for Sarah, the most important people in the audience were sitting in the front row. Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus, now adults who had spent a decade proving that people could genuinely change and that redemption was possible even after the worst mistakes. 10 years ago, in this very room, I told a story about 3 students who made a terrible choice, Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of hard-won wisdom. I spoke about how they had hurt me, how they had almost destroyed their own futures, and how we had chosen a path of healing rather than punishment. She paused, looking directly at Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus. Today, I want to tell you the rest of that story. I want to tell you about what happened when those 3 young people decided to embrace the opportunity for transformation they had been given. For the next hour, Sarah chronicled the remarkable journeys of the 3 people who had once been her tormentors and had become her greatest success story. She spoke about Tyler's work as an educator, about the hundreds of students he had reached and the countless acts of bullying he had prevented. She described Jessica's advocacy for digital ethics and the policies she had helped implement that were protecting vulnerable people from online harassment. She detailed Marcus's work as a social worker and his success in helping other young offenders find their way to redemption. But the most important lesson from their story, Sarah said as she approached her conclusion, is not that they changed. It's that we all have the capacity for both cruelty and compassion, for destruction and healing, for perpetuating cycles of harm or breaking them. She looked out at the audience of educators who had dedicated their lives to working with young people. Every student who walks into your classroom, no matter how challenging their behavior, no matter how deep their pain, carries within them the possibility of transformation. Your job is not to give up on them when they make mistakes, but to help them understand that their mistakes do not define their potential. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, but Sarah's attention was focused on the 3 people in the front row who were applauding with tears streaming down their faces. After the event, Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus joined Sarah for a private dinner at a small restaurant in downtown Millbrook. It was a tradition they had maintained for several years, meeting annually on the anniversary of the freezer incident to reflect on how far they had come and to renew their commitment to the work of healing and growth. I have something to tell you, Sarah said as they settled into their seats. This is going to be my last public speech about our story. The 3 younger people looked at her in surprise. Sarah's advocacy work had become such a central part of her identity that it was difficult to imagine her stepping away from it. It's time, Sarah continued. The story belongs to all of us now, not just to me. And I think the most powerful way for it to continue is through the work that each of you is doing in your own communities. Tyler nodded slowly. You're right. The story was never really about what happened in that freezer. It was about what we chose to do afterward. And that story is still being written, Jessica added. Every time one of us reaches a young person who's making harmful choices, every time we prevent someone from going down the path we went down, we're adding new chapters. Marcus raised his glass in a toast. To Sarah, who saved our lives by believing we could be better than our worst moments. To all of us, Sarah replied. for proving that redemption is possible and that healing can grow from even the deepest wounds. As they shared stories and reflected on the decade that had passed since that November day, they were joined by an unexpected guest. Bob Hayes, the janitor who had rescued Sarah from the freezer, appeared at their table with a shy smile. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting," Bob said, "but I wanted to tell you something before I retire next month." He looked at each of them in turn. "I've been at Lincoln High for 32 years, and I've seen a lot of kids come and go. I've seen plenty of cruelty, and I've seen plenty of kindness. But I've never seen anything like what you four accomplished." Together, Bob's voice became emotional as he continued. "You took the worst thing that happened at that school and turned it into the best thing. You proved that people can change, that communities can heal, and that love really can overcome hate." He paused, struggling to find the words for what he wanted to say. "I just wanted to thank you for showing an old man that miracles are still possible, and that sometimes the most broken things can become the most beautiful." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Bob sharing stories about the transformation he had witnessed at Lincoln High over the years. Students who might have become bullies instead became protectors. Teachers who had been on the verge of burnout found new purpose in creating supportive environments. Administrators learned to see discipline problems as opportunities for growth, rather than simply issues to be managed. As the evening wound down, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. The experience in the freezer had been the worst thing that had ever happened to her, but it had also led to the most meaningful work of her life. She had learned that trauma could be transformed into wisdom, that pain could become purpose, and that the people who hurt us most might also become our greatest teachers. Tyler, Jessica, and Marcus had learned their own lessons about the power of second chances, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of redemption. They had discovered that their past mistakes, while painful and regrettable, could become sources of strength and compassion that allowed them to help others avoid similar pitfalls. But perhaps the most important lesson for all of them was that healing was not a destination, but a journey, one that required constant vigilance, ongoing commitment, and the courage to keep growing even when growth was difficult. As they prepared to part ways, Tyler voiced what they were all thinking. 10 years ago, if someone had told me that the worst day of my life would become the foundation for everything good that followed, I would never have believed them. The freezer that was supposed to break us actually made us stronger," Jessica added. "It forced us to confront who we were and choose who we wanted to become," Marcus nodded. "And it taught us that no one is beyond redemption if they're willing to do the work." Sarah smiled, feeling a deep sense of completion and gratitude. "It taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing harm. It's about believing in people's capacity to grow beyond their mistakes and supporting them in that growth." As they walked out into the cool Millbrook evening, each of them carrying the lessons and the bonds that had sustained them through a decade of transformation, they knew that their story would continue to ripple outward, touching lives they would never know about, inspiring changes they would never witness directly. The freezer room at Lincoln High School had long since been replaced, but the lessons learned in that frozen darkness continued to illuminate paths toward healing and redemption. The story that had begun with cruelty and shame had become a testament to the power of forgiveness, the possibility of change, and the truth that our worst moments can become the foundation for our greatest triumphs. 20 years had passed since that cold November day when everything changed in the cafeteria of Lincoln High School. The world had moved on, technology had evolved, and a new generation of students walked the hallways where the most profound lesson about human transformation had been written in pain and redeemed through forgiveness. Tyler Brooks, now approaching his 40th birthday, stood before the state legislature as the newly appointed Secretary of Education for Ohio, his journey from a cruel teenager to one of the state's most respected educational leaders seemed impossible to those who didn't know his story. But Tyler had learned long ago that impossible transformations were often the most lasting ones. The legislation he was presenting that day would mandate restorative justice programs in every public school in Ohio, making it the first state to implement such a comprehensive approach to addressing harmful behavior in educational settings. As Tyler looked out at the assembled legislators, many of whom had children and grandchildren in the very schools that would benefit from these programs, he thought about the countless students whose lives might be changed by what they were about to vote on. 20 years ago, Tyler began, his voice carrying the authority that came from lived experience rather than just academic credentials. I was a student who made choices that could have destroyed multiple lives, including my own. Today, I stand before you not despite those choices, but because of what I learned from their consequences. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the chamber. The legislation before you today isn't just about policy or procedure. It's about recognizing that every young person who makes a harmful choice stands at a crossroads. They can either be pushed further down a destructive path, or they can be guided toward understanding, accountability, and ultimately, redemption. Tyler went on to present data from the hundreds of schools that had already implemented restorative justice programs based on the Lincoln model. The statistics were compelling. Dramatic reductions in repeat offenses, improved school climate surveys, increased graduation rates, and perhaps most importantly, documented cases of students who had transformed from perpetrators of harm into champions of kindness. But numbers only tell part of the story, Tyler continued. Behind every statistic is a young person who was given the chance to be better than their worst moment. Behind every successful intervention is a community that chose healing over vengeance, growth over punishment. The vote that followed was unanimous, making Ohio a national leader in educational restorative justice. But for Tyler, the real victory wasn't the legislation itself. It was the knowledge that countless future students would be given the same opportunity for transformation that had saved his own life. Meanwhile, Jessica Chun had just finished delivering the commencement address at her alma mater, Stanford University, where she now served as a professor of digital ethics and social responsibility. Her research on the psychological mechanisms of online behavior had become foundational to the field, but her teaching remained grounded in the personal understanding of how easily technology could be used to cause profound harm. Jessica's most recent book, The Conscience of the Internet, Building Empathy in Digital Spaces, had become required reading in computer science and psychology programs around the world. The book combined rigorous academic research with deeply personal narratives about the real-world impact of online cruelty, creating a bridge between theoretical understanding and practical application. Standing at the podium before hundreds of graduating students who would soon enter careers in technology, media, and digital communications, Jessica felt the weight of responsibility that had driven her work for 2 decades. You are about to enter a world where your code, your content, and your choices will shape the experiences of billions of people, she told the graduates. The platforms you build, the algorithms you design, the policies you implement will determine whether technology becomes a force for connection or division, for healing or harm. Jessica spoke about the concept of moral imagination, the ability to envision the human consequences of seemingly abstract decisions. She challenged the graduates to consider not just whether they could build something, but whether they should, and to always ask themselves what kind of world their innovations would create. The most important question you can ask yourself, Jessica concluded, is not whether your technology works, but whether it works for the good of humanity. Because in the end, the measure of our success won't be the elegance of our code or the scale of our platforms. It will be the kind of society we've helped to create. After the ceremony, Jessica was approached by a young graduate student who had been deeply moved by her presentation. "Professor Chun," the student said, I've been working on an app that uses AI to detect and prevent cyberbullying in real time. I was inspired by your research, but I wanted to ask, how do you balance the goal of preventing harm with respect for privacy and free expression? Jessica smiled, recognizing in the student's question the kind of ethical reasoning that gave her hope for the future. Those are exactly the right questions to be asking, she replied. The fact that you're thinking about these tensions means you're already on the right path. The key is to involve diverse voices in your development process, especially those who have experienced the harm you're trying to prevent. She paused, considering how much to share. I can tell you from personal experience that the people who have been hurt by technology often have the clearest vision for how to fix it. Don't just build for users, build with them. Marcus Rivera had found his calling in a different arena, but one that was equally important. Now the director of a national nonprofit organization focused on gang intervention and youth violence prevention, Marcus spent his days working with young people who reminded him daily of who he might have become without intervention. His organization, called Second Chances Coalition, operated in 40 cities across the United States, providing mentorship, education, and support services to at-risk youth. But Marcus's approach was different from traditional social services. He insisted that every program participant hear real stories from people who had walked similar paths and found ways to change direction. On this particular day, Marcus was visiting a detention center in Detroit, meeting with a group of teenagers who had been arrested for a brutal assault that had been live-streamed on social media. The parallels to his own past were unmistakable. But Marcus had learned that the most powerful interventions came from authentic connection rather than preaching. I'm not here to tell you that what you did was wrong, Marcus began, studying the faces of the young people assembled before him. You already know that. I'm here to tell you that what you did doesn't have to define who you become. He shared his own story, not glossing over the details of his participation in Sarah's assault, but focusing on the journey that had followed. He spoke about the shame and self-hatred that had nearly consumed him, about the people who had believed in his potential for change even when he couldn't see it himself, and about the work he had done to transform his pain into purpose. The hardest part isn't admitting that you've done something terrible, Marcus told them. The hardest part is believing that you can be something other than terrible. But I'm here to tell you that you can, because I've seen it happen hundreds of times. One of the young men in the group, a 17-year-old named Antoine, who had been the ringleader of the assault, raised his hand tentatively. But how do you live with knowing you hurt someone like that? How do you wake up every morning carrying that weight? Marcus leaned forward, meeting Antoine's eyes directly. You learn to carry it differently. Instead of letting it crush you, you let it drive you. Every person I help, every kid I reach, every life that gets turned around, that's how I honor the pain I caused. That's how I make my mistakes mean something. The conversation continued for several hours, with Marcus gradually helping the young people understand that accountability and redemption weren't mutually exclusive. They could acknowledge the harm they had caused while still working toward becoming people who would never cause such harm again. As Marcus prepared to leave, Antoine approached him privately. Mr. Rivera, do you really think someone like me can change? I mean really change, not just pretend to be different. Marcus placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. Antoine, I was exactly like you 20 years ago. Angry, violent, convinced that hurting people was the only way to feel powerful. If I can become someone who dedicates his life to preventing violence, then yes, I absolutely believe you can change. But you have to want it, and you have to be willing to do the work. Meanwhile, Dr. Sarah Mitchell was enjoying her retirement in a small house overlooking Lake Erie, but her influence continued to shape educational policy and practice around the world. Now 72 years old, she spent her days writing, gardening, and mentoring young researchers who were continuing the work she had started. Her final book, The Mathematics of Forgiveness, How Restorative Justice Multiplies Healing, had just been published to critical acclaim. The book wove together decades of research on trauma, healing, and human psychology with the deeply personal story of her experience at Lincoln High School. On this quiet morning, Sarah was working in her garden when she received a phone call that would remind her once again of the far-reaching impact of that November day so long ago. The caller was Dr. Amanda Foster, a researcher from the University of Edinburgh who had been studying the long-term outcomes of restorative justice programs. "Dr. Mitchell," Amanda said, her voice filled with excitement, "I wanted to share some findings from our longitudinal study that I think will interest you. We've been tracking the outcomes of students who participated in restorative justice programs, based on your Lincoln model over the past 15 years. Sarah set down her gardening tools and gave the call her full attention. "What did you discover?" "The results are extraordinary," Amanda continued. Students who went through restorative justice programs showed not only dramatically lower recidivism rates, but significantly higher levels of empathy, community engagement, and prosocial behavior compared to control groups. But here's the really remarkable part: their children are also showing better outcomes in terms of emotional regulation and moral reasoning. Sarah felt a familiar warmth spreading through her chest, the same feeling she had experienced every time she learned about another life touched by the principles of restorative justice. "Intergenerational impact," she murmured. "The healing becomes hereditary." "Exactly," Amanda replied. "We're seeing evidence that when people genuinely transform through restorative processes, they pass along not just changed behavior, but changed values and perspectives to the next generation. The ripple effects are literally reproducing themselves across families and communities." After the call ended, Sarah sat quietly in her garden, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The young woman who had been locked in a freezer by cruel teenagers could never have imagined that her response to that trauma would eventually influence the parenting practices of people she would never meet. That evening, Sarah received another call, this one from Tyler, who had become like a son to her over the years. He was calling with news that the restorative justice legislation had passed, but also with something more personal to share. "Sarah," Tyler said, his voice thick with emotion, "Emma just told me she's pregnant. I'm going to be a grandfather." Sarah smiled, thinking about the young man who had once been consumed with hatred and violence, now preparing to welcome a new generation into a family defined by love and healing. "That's wonderful news, Tyler. Have you thought about what kind of grandfather you want to be?" Tyler was quiet for a moment before answering. "I want to be the kind who teaches her that people can be better than their worst moments. I want her to grow up believing in second chances and the power of forgiveness." "She learned those lessons by watching how you live," Sarah replied. "And from everything I've seen over the past 20 years, she's going to have an extraordinary role model." As Sarah ended the call and prepared for bed, she thought about the invisible threads that connected all their lives. Tyler's future granddaughter would grow up in a world shaped by the choices made in the school cafeteria 2 decades earlier. Jessica's research would influence the digital environments that child would navigate. Marcus's work would help create safer communities for her to explore. The story that had begun with cruelty and almost ended in tragedy had become something larger than any of them could have imagined, a living demonstration that transformation was possible, that healing could triumph over harm, and that the worst moments of our lives could become the foundations for our greatest contributions. 20 years later, the freezer room that had once symbolized humanity at its cruelest had become a metaphor for something entirely different. The possibility that even in our darkest moments, even when we seem beyond redemption, the capacity for change remains alive within us, waiting for someone brave enough to believe in it and patient enough to nurture it into growth. The ripples continued to spread, touching lives that would never know their origin, creating waves of kindness and understanding that would outlast all of them. And in that continuation, in that endless propagation of healing and hope, the true legacy of that November day lived on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.